Okay, I want to connect several of the previous videos into one why 2027 matters. So we'll run through the 2026 story so far. The story connects two wars, a fuel shortage, and the AI build, and possibly your pension. So this is not a conspiracy. Every number in this figure comes from a government agency, a company filing, a bank's own research, and Fry's assuming that they're correct. The mainstream media doesn't often offer the news we'll discuss in the video. So it's no secret Fry's own view is that unpleasant economic and associated issues will follow in 2027. However, I'll run through links in the chain that I've built to support my proposition. Okay, Fry wants to talk about the puzzle. Things aren't looking quite right. There's a hot war effect in the Gulf, and the crude oil price has been going down. Currently, the price is about $83.25 for West Texas, well off the peak of $114.58 back in April, and things have been getting worse in the Gulf. On the 17th of August, American diesel crack spread hit an all-time high of $102.20 a barrel. The crack is simply the price of the diesel minus the price of crude, so the refiner's margin. In a balanced market, it runs at between $15 and $30. So it's running, between 4 and 6 times its normal. How can the raw material be getting cheaper while the finished product goes vertical? That gap is what we'll discuss. Earlier this year, Jefferies put it neatly. The shock is showing up in cracks, not crude. And a very important point. Crude is the financial barrel traded by the algorithms and pushed about by the strategic reserve releases, the manipulation. The crack is the physical one. When they disagree, believe the physical. Okay, most people picture oil refining as a tap, crude in, fuel out. And if you want more fuel, you open the tap. Obviously, that's a tad simplistic. There are 3 separate gates that we must consider. First, configuration. Crude comes in grades, light and sweet through to heavy and sour, and every refinery is built for a particular brew. Diesel doesn't come from the distillation tower. It comes from the expensive secondary kit, the cokers and hydrocrackers. Here's the proof. In August, American refiners ran at 97.2% of capacity. That's the highest since 2019. And the distillate output, diesel output, still fell, according to the EIA. So utilization was never the problem. Second point, location. Products travel by ship and pipeline. California can't simply ring the Gulf Coast for a top-up. The West Coast lacks the connectivity, so it leans on imports from Asia. So we'll hold that thought, and we'll come back to it on the next slide. It's the nastiest link in this chain. Third, throughput. What's actually running, not what's on paper. Note the figure in the mainstream media quotes is capacity, and capacity is the wrong metric. A bombed refinery still counts as capacity in that number. Use the real one instead. global refinery runs were 80.9 million barrels a day in July, nearly 5 million below a year earlier. And that's a monthly increase, according to the IEA. The IEA's own words. Capacity elsewhere in the system is currently unable to offset product supply bottlenecks. Thus, the agency itself is making Fry's argument for him. Runs are forecast down 2.5 million barrels a day on average this year, potentially rebounding to 3.5 million barrels next year. And that rebound obviously assumes that the shooting stops. And it doesn't look that way at present. Now, we'll have to consider the other war. Ukraine has spent 2026 progressively working through the Russian refining system and has now struck all 10 of their largest plants. Estimates of capacity lost run from 20% to 42%, depending on who's counting, whether it's the Kiev Post or the Moscow Daily. Russian crude processing fell to about 3.9 million barrels a day, the lowest in 21 years. Moscow banned exports of petrol, jet fuel and diesel and started importing fuel. And sanctions blocks on the western parts and catalysts Russia needs to repair the damage. So, Russia still pumps crude. It can no longer refine it, so it exports more crude and less product. The war has changed the mix of what reaches the market, not the total energy. Crude supply loosens, diesel supply tightens. A falling crude price sits next to a record crack is not a contradiction at all. It's exactly what you'd predict in this situation. And the West had already stepped back. The war hit a system that had been shrinking for 5 years. Since 2020, roughly 3.5 million barrels a day of refining has closed permanently across Europe, Japan, United States, and here in Australia, 3 of the 4 refineries have closed, only leaving Geelong. California's the sharpest case. Counting closures and conversions together, the state has lost about 575,000 barrels a day of conventional refining. It's down to 6 crude refineries. It now imports about 40% of its petrol and 35% of its jet and diesel. Meanwhile, roughly 6 million barrels a day is being built in Asia and the Middle East. However, this is the point mainstream media commentators miss. Those are petrochemical integrated complexes, deliberately pivoting towards making plastics and fibres rather than transport fuel. So the West is not just losing capacity, it's changing what kind of fuel the world makes. So consider, product built in Shandong doesn't solve a shortage in Los Angeles next Tuesday. And here's a nasty bit. California's replacement supply was supposed to be Asia. India, South Korea and Taiwan account for about 2/3 of its petrol imports. But Asia's feedstock comes through Hormuz. When the strait closed, Korean refiners cut runs. And on the 2nd of April, South Korea, California's biggest jet fuel supplier, suspended jet exports altogether. West Coast jet stocks fell to 2.6 million barrels against a normal 9 to 11 million barrels, lowest for that time of year in 23 years. Thus, the backup plan and the original problem were never independent. That's not diversification. That's the same bet twice. And remember that phrase, because on slide 7, Fryer's going to show you the identical mistake sitting inside your pension. So what did they actually do? Well, California rang the Gulf Coast after all. By suspending the law that forbade it, the Jones Act says cargo between US ports must move on US flagged US crude ships. In March, Washington waived that, the broadest waiver since 1950. Result: 10.7 million barrels into the West Coast, an 83% addition over the trend, and more jet fuel from other US regions than in the previous 36 years combined. Trump extended it another 90 days on the 10th of August. Note, that fix isn't free. Gulf refiners went to the normal 95 to 96% utilisation, up to near 98%, and deferred their scheduled maintenance turnarounds to keep the fuel flowing west. Deferred maintenance is borrowed time, and it's part of why the national distillate number keeps drawing instead of building. Here's the link everyone's talking about. The AI build is not bottlenecked by chips or by money. It's bottlenecked by copper, steel, and processed gas. Close to half of the planned American data center builds for 2026 are expected to be delayed or cancelled due to shortages of transformers, switchgear, and batteries. Of 16 gigawatts announced, only 5 were actually under construction. Lead times for a large power transformer now averages around 128 weeks, compared to 2 years or less before 2020. And the components holding everything else up are less than 10% of the build cost. Okay? So 90% of the money is waiting on 10% of the parts. Add the processed gas that Fryer's rabbited on about many times. The strikes on Ras Laffan removed 30% of the world's semiconductor-grade helium in a few days, with repairs expected to be 3 to 5 years because of the global turbine shortage. So stating it plainly, a tiny input share can carry enormous output constraint. Thus, it's Fryer's weak links. Diesel, helium, and transformers are all weak links, and all three are currently being squeezed by the same two wars. Okay, so who's holding all the risk? The AI build-out is expensive. It's slower than promised and increasingly financed by debt. The question Fryer keeps coming back to is not whether the hyperscalers are overvalued, rather it's who ends up getting hit with the bathwater. 4 routes, and they sit in 4 different sleeves of a pension or insurance portfolio, each with a different risk label onto the folder. First, listed equity. The top 10 names are roughly 38% of the S&P 500. If you own a stock tracker, index tracker, you own that whether you meant to or not. Corporate credit. Morgan Stanley expects $570 billion of AI-related issuance this year. Long-dated investment grade is precisely what life insurers buy to match their liabilities. Private credit. Whoa. American life insurers hold roughly $807 billion in private and specialist debt, and the regulators are now actively probing the data center subset. That one is a worry. Securitized paper, data center asset-backed and mortgage-backed issuance has grown from 4 billion in 2020 to 61 billion to the middle of this year. And pension funds and insurers are among the most active buyers. 4 labels, 1 underlying question: whether the AI build gets paid for. Those are not 4 independent bets. That's the whole argument, and it's worth contemplating. And remember, California, 4 sleeves that look separate, 1 shock underneath. Same mistake, different asset class. Okay, so Fry's just spent the last 15 minutes making a case, and here's some balance. What would show it was wrong? First, inventories rebuild. American distillate stocks were 105.6 million barrels in mid-August, the lowest for this time of year since the mid-1990s. A solid autumn build and the scarcity story is over. It has to happen. 2, the crack normalizes, back below roughly $40, and the physical shortage is resolving on its own. High prices ration demand and pull refinery runs up. That adjustment is real and it works in months, not years, if it happens. Number 3, Russian runs recover. Any credible sign of repaired capacity returning changes the global product balance quickly. Obviously, we don't know that answer. Anyone can claim afterwards that they called it. Naming one's counter-argument in advance is how you work out whether you're actually any good at this. It's a useful discipline that I covered in Tetlock's forecasting study. Blanchard and Gay, 2007, showed modern economies handle oil shocks far better than the 1970s ones did. Less energy per unit of output, better anchored expectations. Fry's case is that this shock is different because it is in refined product rather than crude, and that it's an argument to be won, not an assumption. One more, and Fry will say it before anyone else does. Demand destruction is already showing. The IEA has cut its second half demand forecast by 550,000 barrels a day and now expects global oil demand to fall 1.6 million barrels a day this year. Some will say that's the market fixing itself. Fry's reading: a 1.6 million barrel fall in a world demand isn't a polite rebalancing. That is activity being priced out. That's the recession arriving early and under a different name. So watch 2027. So the 5 things Fry thinks we should be watching, and 4 of them are free. The diesel crack, the physical signal, and unlike the flat crude price, it can't be pushed around by a futures desk, reserve a release, or other dodgy administration deals. Distillate inventories, published weekly by the EIA. They're free and the single cheapest indicator on the list. If you only track one number, track this one. New issue coverage on hyperscaler debt. Order books fell nearly 5 times covered in February to under 2 by July, according to Apollo. And that's funding window measured directly. An equity market can shrug a newspaper front page for years. A bond book that won't clear cannot. And data center credit spreads. Barclays now treats Oracle's credit default swap as a hedge on AI capex generally, rather than a view on Oracle the company. So when a bank starts describing a single name that way, it's telling us where the risk actually sits. And fifth, the Jones Act waiver extended 90 days on the 10th of August, so it lapses around the 8th of November. So we get a dated real-world experiment. Either the West Coast has found other supply by then, or the emergency plumbing gets extended again. Fry's watching which, because an emergency measure that keeps getting renewed isn't an emergency anymore. It's the new normal. Credit tends to crack before equity does. Watch the funding window, not the headlines. Private credit is cracking. Okay, to finish up on Fry's chain links. Wars damage refineries. Refineries make diesel. Diesel moves the trucks and the tractors and the construction plants. That's not a forecast, it's a supply chain, and anyone can check every link themselves. The same shortages are slowing the AI build, and the money funding that build is increasingly pension and insurance money, arriving through 4 doors marked with different risk labels. Fry's own reading is that this shows up properly next year, 2027, once the hedges and the long-term contracts roll off and need to be repriced. But you don't have to agree with the date to find this useful. You just need to know where to look and to consider what would change your mind. A thought to take away: when the financial price and the physical price disagree, the physical one is usually telling the truth. Good luck to all. There are some big moves coming up and down.